Hi, welcome to the Red Couch Rebuttal, a roundtable that we are conducting today. We have a group of adoptees here with us to speak on this subject. First up, we have Lorene Pittman, who is the author of the book, The Lies That Bind.
Thank you, Andy. We're all here to talk about the film Stories from the Red Couch, which is a film that was produced by the Cradle, an adoption agency, a very old institution in Chicago. It's promoted as simply a Hollywood-produced film about adoption and described as a project meant to capture 99 years of the Cradle's work through emotional, inspiring stories of adoption. It's Hollywood produced, all right. It's a polished, obviously professionally produced and edited documentary style film, but to say it's about adoption is terribly misleading. What it's really about is fundraising to facilitate adoption. The Cradle is a private adoption agency that's been around for nearly 100 years. The film is presented and stylized as a celebration of the Cradle's work by showcasing several successful adoption stories from the perspective of the heroic savior adoptive parents and the counselors employed by the Cradle. The fairy tale-like stories portray adoption as something magical and the Cradle as some place where dreams come true. Lofty words and phrases describing the Cradle and its work, such as destiny, meant to be, special place, and even divine intervention are sprinkled throughout the 45-minute campaign. What's missing? It's obvious to adoptees. Whether you're well-adjusted or struggling, in the fog or out, wrestling with identity issues, facing secondary rejection, muddling through a reunion, or fighting against the powers that be in a closed records nightmare, the emotional turmoil of the adoptee is sorely missing from the Cradle's fables of the adoptive family. Even adoptees who claim a happy childhood and successful family life growing up adopted face issues related to adoption trauma. It's a fact. The deep emotional experiences of great loss and grief are a common theme in the life of an adoptee. The trauma related to being separated from one's mother and family at birth or soon thereafter is real. It may not be something an adoptee feels as a child growing up, but it often surfaces later in life, particularly during milestone events like marriage, childbirth, or death of an adoptive parent or someone else close to the adoptee. In the film, the Cradle claims to be a place that recognizes and nurtures a pregnant mother struggling with the decision of whether to keep her child. How does a mother even get to that point? How is the option of adoption introduced to a pregnant mother who is under duress? I turned to the Cradle's website for answers. The Cradle is proud of their on-site nursery. The website proclaims the Cradle is the only adoption agency in the country with an on-site nursery offering a safe, neutral place for infants to stay while their parents take the time they need to decide if adoption will be the plan for their child. So the mother and child are separated while the mother decides if adoption is right for their family situation. This is where the options counseling comes in. There is little positive or encouraging information on the website about the choice to parent. And there was even less mentioned in the film. What about options for parenting? What about support for the mother and child together rather than a nursery that separates the mother and child? The website's page for option counseling is sparse and includes a simple comparison of adoption and parenting that lists the things an expectant mother should consider, according to the Cradle, if she is thinking about parenting her own child. Things like your daily schedule and childcare needs, your budget, including housing, living expenses, bills, baby supplies, transportation, childcare, etc., healthcare and medical insurance, and who are the supportive people in your life. Identify those who are there for you and talk with them about the kinds of help you can expect from them. Well, that's enough to scare the living motherhood out of me. Where are the answers? Where are the resources? And to make matters even more one-sided, the page on the website that features the nursery also features a big window with continuous scrolling photos of hopeful, smiling, potential adoptive parents with the caption, "Choose an adoptive family." Problem solved. The film does mention that a parent who has taken advantage of the Cradle's services, like counseling and the nursery, can of course decide to keep her child and simply come and get the baby and take her home. Good to know. If the Cradle actually does this work, like counseling in favor of keeping your child and directing a mother and or father to usable resources, why not highlight that in the film? Why not highlight a few of the stories where this sort of happy ending resulted? Or at least provide some statistics. I know I would have loved to have seen a few of these real life fairy tales where mother decides to keep her child. I mean, really, this sounds like a much happier and more natural ending to any story than a child separated from his or her biology and family and thrown into the arms of strangers. Note to adoptive parents, that baby isn't bonding with you. It's a matter of life or death for the baby. Her needs must be met. It's actually survival mode. But there are no family preservation style happy endings shown in the film. That's because The Cradle is about adoption, more specifically, facilitating the brokering of babies, period.
Thank you, Lorene. Up next, we have Lynn Grubb, who is the editor of the Adoptee Survival Guide. She is also an adoptee who was adopted from the cradle.
Thank you, Andi. My husband and I sat on the red couch when we visited the cradle 10 years ago. My parents also sat on the red couch when they adopted me over 50 years ago. It's tradition. The cradle has traditionally used fundraising to continue running its business, which was started 99 years ago to find a baby for the founder's sister. Fashion shows with big name designers were an early favorite. Newspaper reporters from years ago played up the Hollywood connection of white adoptive parents. Think Bob Hope and George Burns. Last year, I was able to interview a former employee of the cradle. She told me a haunting story about a first mother who pounded on the door in the middle of the night wanting her baby back. From the very start of the documentary, you hear a woman's voice singing, "Rescue Me." It was a stretch, I have to admit, to continue watching any further because of the savior vibes. Mostly you hear from the paid staff of the cradle. You do hear from one adoptee named Anne. She is the daughter of a former employee of the cradle. In an emotional moment, she reads the question she has for her first mother, which sadly she will never get answered because her birth mom passed away before they could reunite. You hear from Anne's brother and you learn she has a positive reunion with extended family. This is the only adoptee viewpoint shared during the documentary, and in my opinion, it's because it's palatable. We never have to see the messy side of reunion. Anne's adoptive mom says she used to run the nursery and likes the cradle's post-adoption services because, quote, it protects everyone in the adoption triad. For me personally, I don't think I need protection from my own family, but because my birth certificate was sealed by the state of Illinois, I was forced to take advantage of post-adoption services at the cradle in 2006 at the cost of $500. Although it was a positive and professional experience and it resulted in a reunion with my first mother and counseling was available, I never felt 100% comfortable taking advantage of any of the cradle's services because they were also the same people that were withholding all my records from me. As you can see, I have deeply mixed feelings about the cradle. I am thankful that my first mom chose a state-of-the-art nursery and a non-religious agency to work with, but I'm also very deeply disappointed in how they presented this documentary, focusing mostly on the adoptive parent perspective. Relinquishment causes trauma for babies and mothers. Adoption agencies will never tell you that adoptees are 4 times more likely to attempt and complete suicide. Of course, every child deserves a family, and not every mother can or will parent. If you are a prospective adoptive parent watching this, please consider adopting from foster care instead of funding a private adoption agency like the Cradle. When you support private adoption agencies, you are also supporting the multi-billion-dollar adoption industry, unethical adoption attorneys, and corrupt baby brokers.
Please welcome Tracy Hammond. She is a writer and adoptee advocate who was also adopted from the Cradle. Welcome, Tracy.
Hi. Thank you. I was adopted from the Cradle in 1970 during the closed adoption era. And in 2013, I contacted the Cradle to get information. I was unaware that Illinois had released original birth certificates to adoptees at that time, and they gladly took my $125 to provide me a background report. A background report that contained information that I found completely shocking. My adoptive parents gleefully recounted the story of their request to the agency. My mother's request was she did not want a child with red hair. My father's request was he didn't want any Polish children. However, they were perfectly fine with getting a boy or a girl. They already had a boy, a girl would be nice, but either or would be okay. And I was raised that way. I was raised with the pretense that I was German and Norwegian. They really didn't know who was German, who was Norwegian, but I was a 50-50 mix is what it was presented as. Well, you can imagine my shock when I got my non-identifying information to find out that I am in fact half Polish. Yes, that's right, folks. I was raised in a household that did not like Polish people, and I'm half Polish. I spent my entire life trying to blend, trying to look Nordic, lightening my hair, and, just really never felt comfortable in my skin, and now we know why. It's, shocking when I read through my non-identifying information, just the amount of information that was withheld, just even the fact that, telling my adoptive parents that, my ethnic background, not lying about it. Now, when I read it, and it goes into quite some detail, my paternal grandparents were both in concentration camps during World War II. Obviously, the Cradle didn't want to pass off damaged goods, maybe they wanted to whitewash. But I have if a Polish family would have presented themselves to the Cradle, mysteriously, I would have been Polish again. And we all know that. They took me and they fit me into whatever box would work in order to make the sale. When my non-identifying information was concluded, I was informed that my mother was dead, that one of my aunts had contacted the Cradle and given that information that she had died and left contact information and had given them a copy of the death certificate. When I concluded my phone call with the Cradle, they wouldn't tell me my mother's name. They had her death certificate. They would not tell me my mother's name. It was incredibly cruel to make me sit there and wait until my aunt got a hold of me. It's just ridiculous. And these people want to show the pretty side of adoption. They'll say that it's about protecting privacy. They had my mother's death certificate. They had one of my aunts saying to release the information. They were shocked. They also were shocked that they didn't give me a copy of the death certificate because the Cradle shredded it. It's just ridiculous. I also found out that another one of my aunts left contact information, but the Cradle saw fit not to include it in my file.
We'd like to take a moment now and kind of talk about what we've just heard from two adoptees from the Cradle.
I have a question for both of you. This film is made and it's supposedly about fundraising. They need money to keep up their work. And I know that they didn't really talk much about their post-adoption services, but both of you, Tracy and Lynn, took advantage of what they had to offer, which was helpful in some way, especially for Lynn, not so much for Tracy. But Lynn, I know you said they had charged you $500. I don't remember what year that was in, but Tracy, you were charged $125 at first and then $300 later to get additional information about your birth father. I mean, did they tell you why the prices were what they were, or what the money was for? I mean, the records are there, right? I mean, all they had to do was look up this information that they obviously had in their files already.
Lynn, you want to go first, or
Yeah,
let me?
yeah, that's fine. I'll talk about my experience. Well, in my case, she had to track down my birth mother, but you know, she had her full name and her last known address, so I can't imagine it was that hard. It took the Cradle a week for the social worker to find her. All of these fees are posted on their website. At least they were in 2006 when I took advantage of them. Since that time, the Cradle has cut their search fee in half, according to the social worker, and the confidential intermediary program in Illinois is now free. So I have a feeling they got a lot of complaints that their fees were too high. But yeah, I think it was exorbitant for the amount of service that they provide.
For me, it was $125 for non-identifying information, which was just basically going through my file and just them typing up 3 pages of everything my mother told them, but without any names. The search fee was $300 to find my father's family. They already knew that he was dead because my mother provided his name and his brother's name and his mother's name, all the information, and they were able to find my uncle's address, and they sent 2 letters to him, and then they sent another letter to my cousin, who's also is a junior. So they thought it was maybe a second address, and they tried that, and that's how I got in contact. So they charged me $300 for basically 3 letters and pulling 2 addresses off the internet. So it's, you know, but they did tell me my father had died in 1972. It was exorbitant. You know, it wasn't like, you know, they were making phone calls around town or anything like that. You know, they had access to, you know, a database and sent a couple letters.
I have a question, Tracy, for you. And that is, so this is all information that if they had provided you with names, you could have done this yourself. You could have made these contacts. You didn't need them to act on your behalf. Is that how you feel about that? And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. I could have absolutely reached out and it would have been better received. My uncle said to me, you know, I received this letter and on the envelope it talked about the Cradle Adoption Agency, and he shredded it because he's like, you know, what in the world is this, an advertisement? He never even opened it. He's like, what do they want with me? So they sent 2 letters to him, and he's thinking that he's on some kind of mailing list for donations. But my cousin had opened his letter and then contacted his father, who was on vacation, and said, hey, listen, you know, I don't know if you got one of these, but, you know, apparently, you know, your brother had a child. They didn't know about me, but yes, I could have absolutely made these contacts on my own. I wouldn't have necessarily been able to find my paternal family through DNA because they're so recently in this country. My father was born in Germany as a displaced person, and so was my uncle. They actually came to the United States in 1951. And my mother's family, nobody really knew what my father's last name was. They just, you know, had known him as Rich, those who had met him. But yes, I could have absolutely taken care of that on my own.
We'd like to welcome Becky Drennan. Becky is a Baby Scoop era adoptee. She is a kinship care provider for her grandchild, and she is a writer and adoptee advocate. So welcome, Becky.
Thank you, Andy. So I guess I had some pretty visceral reactions, as you've heard from others who have watched stories from the Red Couch. I think what struck me a lot is the staff from the Cradle talk a good game about presenting all sides of adoption. But after listening to Lynn and Tracy, it's really clear that there are situations the Cradle doesn't advertise in their film. So I'd like to dig a little deeper into this fundraising documentary, which is what it is. For me, a disturbing missing piece in this film is the lack of discussion about the best interests of the adopted person. I've volunteered as a CASA guardian ad litem for about 6 years. And during that time, I've advocated for 8 different children. The overarching responsibility for the child welfare system and the courts is to determine what's in the best interests of the child. And though the adoptive parents interviewed for this film seem to have a different motivation, I know from my lived experience that there are lots of caregivers who are not motivated by their desire to be a parent, but rather because a child cannot live with their biological parents for any variety of reasons. If the Cradle truly wanted to present all sides of adoption, they would have included more than one adoptee's point of view. They would have included stories about women who came to their agency who ultimately decided to parent, and they would have included stories of birth parents who relinquished. Instead, most of the 44 minutes of this film is spent on stories of adoptive parents. Even when the lone adoptee tells her story, at points her adoptive mother speaks for her as if she were still a child. The Cradle focuses only on the glossy Hollywood version of adoption. The adoptive parents interviewed for this film are clear about their reasons for adopting. Each of them stated some version of, I wanted to be a mom and we wanted to be parents. The Cradle staff opines that they help parents realize their dreams of a family. They also note that the journey for each adoptive parent is different, completely ignoring that the adoptive parents wouldn't be on that journey if there weren't birth parents and adoptees. The message I take away from the journeys of these adoptive parents is that if a child fulfills their need to be parents, it's not about giving a home to a child because it was best for the child. The Cradle counselors also spoke emotionally and eloquently about the journey of a birth parent. Note that the counselors spoke on behalf of the birth parents. I'm guessing that the birth parents wouldn't have romanticized their journey the way the Cradle staffers did. At one point in the film, a counselor ticked off a list of reasons birth parents give for not parenting. I'm not mentally prepared. I'm not emotionally prepared. I don't have family support. My family can't be trusted to help me. I'm concerned I can't keep the child safe from domestic violence. Do you notice what's missing here? Not one of the reasons given by a birth parent is, I don't want to be a parent. Adoption is a long-term solution for what is often a short-term set of issues. If the Cradle's counselors were truly concerned about what is best for the babies they claim to care so deeply about, perhaps they should work with birth parents who have short-term challenges more actively to see if those challenges can be overcome. Counseling, assistance, getting out of a domestic violence situation, financial assistance finding daycare, brainstorming and developing a support system. If they truly offered this support, how many families could have stayed together? Those would have been some heartwarming stories worthy to be told in a documentary about an adoption agency. If this agency truly supported the entire adoption constellation, they would work first to keep families together instead of creating trauma for the child and his or her biological family that is inevitable when adoption occurs. This, however, would not make sense for their business model, for it's the fees paid by adoptive parents and the likelihood of continued donations from grateful adoptive parents that pays their salaries and keeps the lights on. If they actively provide resources for birth parents to keep their children, their business model falls apart. The unspoken thread running through this fundraising documentary is that adoptive families are superior to birth families and more deserving to raise a child. This narrative needs to change. Generations of baby scoop era adoptees and birth parents are using their collective voices to educate society of the true impact of adoption. This 100-year-old adoption agency and their dated red couch show that they continue to live in the past with the narrative of adoption viewed primarily through the lens of agency staff and adoptive parents. A clear view of adoption cannot be understood until society forgets about the money involved in adoption and recognizes that bringing loving families together through adoption tears other families apart.
Please welcome Baby Scoop era adoptee Lynn Miller. She is a late discovery adoptee who writes and blogs about her experience at adopteerevelations.com. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you, Andy. First, I want to say that I was adopted privately. My parents did not work with an adoption agency, so I don't have any firsthand experience with the Cradle or any other adoption agency. I watched the movie. I went into it with an open mind, and I watched the film expecting to see Cradle adoptees tell their stories. Strangely, it seems adopted people were not consulted in the making of the movie. Well, okay, there is one adoptee, a young woman who talked about what it was like to be adopted, her lifelong curiosity about her birth parents, and her search to find her biological family. While her story is compelling, it's only one adoption story, and a carefully selected one at that. Our featured adoptee happens to be the adopted daughter of a former employee of the Cradle. In my mind, a documentary, a movie that purports to be a documentary, aims for objectivity and the presentation of facts. Stories from the Red Couch is not an adoption documentary so much as a polished and professional fundraising and marketing effort for the Cradle. With emotionally evocative music, photos, and stories, the film showcases the agency's work, its employees and parents who adopted children from the Cradle. The agency comes across as a magical place that matches wonderful parents with wonderful kids. Everything works out perfectly for everyone. If the film seems like something straight out of Hollywood, it actually is. Cinema Relics Productions, led by a Hollywood writer, producer, and father of 2 kids adopted from the Cradle, worked with the Cradle to create the film. Anyone who wants to find out what it's like to be adopted needs to listen to adoptees. Read our blogs and books. Listen to our podcasts. We're not keeping quiet about adoption anymore. While our stories are all unique, we all live with missing pieces and unanswered questions about biological family, ancestry, medical history, just to name a few of the issues. Being adopted doesn't start out beautifully. Think about what it would be like to be a helpless baby, separated from her biological mother, at the mercy of the powers that be to find replacement parents. Adoption is complicated, and for some adoptees, it's devastating. I would think potential donors who took the time to watch Stories from the Red Couch would be interested in hearing from more Cradle adoptees. Thank you.
Next, we have Jamie Weiss, an adoptee from a domestic infant adoption in the 1970s, in reunion with First Family. A writer at Signed, Sealed, Adopted, Jamie is also the co-chair of the Georgia Alliance for Adoptee Rights. Welcome, Jamie.
Thanks, Monty. All right. Okay. Rock-a-bye baby in the treetop. When the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall, and down will come baby, cradle and all. We've all heard this familiar nursery rhyme. And while a variety of claims have been made as to the origins of it, as an adopted person with knowledge of the very dark underbelly of the adoption industry, I believe it could very well be the beginning of an adoption tale. No, not a magical fairy tale, but a very dark adoption tale, although a very common one. Imagine for a moment that the tree is a mother, holding her child ever so close and lovingly in her boughs. They gaze at one another, seeing their own face reflected back. They are a natural unit of comfort and peace. A gentle breeze blows and they draw closer to share the warmth of their bodies and souls as one. From a nearby bush, a lonely sprite watches Mother Tree and her baby, and she longs for a bond like that. The wind is steadily increasing and the sprite notices that Mother Tree and baby are struggling to hold on to one another. She hears the distinct crack of a breaking bough and notices baby dangerously rocking around before gravity begins to take its course, bringing the broken bough, the cradle, and baby tumbling down, down, down. The sprite takes flight to go help rescue the falling baby, or Mother Tree, but in that instant she realizes that this is her chance, her opportunity to save this baby and experience the joy and love that the baby will surely have springing from the greatness of being rescued. And then it was decided, instead of helping to safely place baby back into Mother Tree's boughs, She scoops the baby into her arms and flies off, believing it would be much better to remove baby from the wind and prevent this from ever happening again. The sprite thought that the baby would find a much safer place to lay its head inside of her own home, in the hollow of a tree, where the wind could never rock the cradle again. Mother Tree was left with a broken bough and a broken heart to weather the wind all alone. Baby was left without understanding what had happened, and baby grew always wondering to which tree she belonged. Now, maybe you're asking yourself how any of this relates to the stories from the Red Couch film recently produced, promoting the Cradle Adoption Agency in Illinois. Well, let me give you a glimpse into my thoughts as an adopted person after viewing the video. The Cradle's website states that the Cradle has a long history in adoption services. It was founded in 1923 by Florence Dahl Walworth. Miss Walworth was born in Chicago, Illinois in 1877. And shortly after her graduation from North Division High School, Florence married William Bradley Walworth, an attorney. They lived in Evanston and had 4 children. In 1914, Florence began her work in adoption through a personal encounter when her sister lost a child at birth. Mrs. Walworth put her wits as well as her sympathies to work and found a child whose mother was compelled by circumstances to place her baby with an adoptive family. Because of her success in this endeavor, other childless couples she knew asked her for help. And a few years later, she found the Cradle. Like the sprite, Mrs. Walworth had an opportunity to be a helper, but she helped the wrong person. Instead of helping this mother in her circumstance, she instead used this opportunity to take the baby for herself, or in Miss Walworth's case, for her sister. She apparently found easy success that she began an entire business around doing this for others. And yes, it is a business. There is a product and there is a payment. It's a little modern day Robin Hood, taking from the rich and giving to the poor. Well, or actually a little reverse Robin Hood, taking babies from the poor or unfortunate and giving them to the rich. So if you view this film or the next time you hear Rockabye Baby, take some time to consider, are you a helper? Who are you actually helping?
Please welcome Renee Gellin. Renee is a birth mother and the founder of SOS, Saving Our Sisters. Thank you for being here, Renee.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So, talking a little bit, I want to go into the nursery and addressing kind of that scenario and how that's kind of touted really as a good thing in the film, and really what that nursery does and the intent behind it from a natural family perspective is really to separate that mom and baby. So getting that mom and that baby separated prevents bonding. And so they may, pose that as something that is giving mom time to think and all of that. But really, mom is really in a position where she is feeling powerless. She's feeling overwhelmed, and she's feeling like she doesn't have the ability to be the kind of parent that she wants to be. So all of that, and then separating her baby on top of it, does not help that. It does not help her make a better decision or give her the information that she needs. But it prevents her from bonding to her child. And that is a problem. Mom and babies need to be, put together, kept together. Everybody has heard about the golden hour right after a baby is born. You don't want to interfere with that. That is a bonding experience. And in adoption, when that happens, and you have adoptive parents in the hospital room, in the hospital, that is preventing that bonding. And that is something that should not be messed with, and it should not be an option. She should have the ability to bond with her baby and have an uninterrupted relationship with her baby without any distractions, and making sure that she is able to bond. That bond doesn't come just by being pregnant. That bond comes by holding that baby, by nursing that baby, and building that bond. The baby, on the other hand, bonds in utero. So the baby knows mom's smell, sound, taste. And when the baby is then separated, all of that the baby knows is just gone. And that's completely traumatizing to the baby. It is not good for the baby. And so touting this separation, this trial separation for her to make a decision is not good for either party. It is really only benefits the adoption agency and the prospective adoptive parents, which is a problem. The focus is on the wrong people. The focus needs to be on the baby and what is best for that baby. That's what adoption is supposed to be. Adoption is supposed to be best for the baby. Separating a mom and baby unnecessarily is not the right answer. So, and the other side of that, where they're mentioning that she has time to, think about her decision and maybe revoke her consent, because she's feeling so unempowered and overwhelmed with her current situation, and by not having any help to remedy that situation, she doesn't really feel empowered to be able to go and do that revocation. First of all, she's likely not been informed of how to do it, if she's been even given her paperwork when she signed her relinquishment papers or the temporary guardianship papers. Usually moms today, from what we've seen at SOS, do not get copies of what they sign. We have to help them get those copies. And they don't know how to get them. They don't even have the wherewithal to even know how to even start to request those. So they're really not in their right mind. Being in a crisis pregnancy is something that is very overwhelming and very debilitating and paralyzing. Depression is part of it as well. So it's all of that, these things that they're talking about with separating mom, and is not helping her at all make any kind of a clear decision. It's literally to separate them. I want to talk about a little bit about the whole options counseling as well. And, our stance at SOS and mine personally is anyone who is doing options counseling that will benefit in any manner from whatever decision is made is bias. So adoption entities providing adoption counseling will not benefit if a mom chooses to parent. So they're not really giving the full story of what does it mean to relinquish? What are your lifelong trauma that's going to affect you? What are those triggers that are going to affect you? You're going to hear your child's name. You're going to hear your child's adoptive parent's name. You're going to see a license plate from a different state. These are all triggers for me personally, right? But all of those things, they're always there. I work in software implementation, and we talk about adoption of the system all of the time. It is in my face 24/7. It does not go away. And that stuff, it affects me, and it affects moms on a daily basis. Every time they see another baby, the same age as their child, every time they're out in public, the birthdays come, all of that stuff. So the whole options counseling is really biased. It is not providing complete and informed consent, fully exploring the trauma, fully exploring the risks of relinquishment, talking about potentially adoptees not understanding why they were relinquished and how damaging that is to them when they don't understand that why. And they don't have contact. So going back to, I'll touch on that in a second, the open adoption piece. But, we really have to make sure that when we're talking about counseling and options and facilitating these adoptions, that ethics are followed. And, there are so many things that are happening today that are not, ethical. Calling a birth mom is before she's even signed any papers, before her revocation period is over. That is not ethical. That is brainwashing. It is grooming, and getting her to dissociate from her baby during the process by using that is a process. It's something that they do on purpose. They have a method, and the deck is stacked against a mom when she connects with an agency. She doesn't really realize it, but you know, those of us who've gone through it know exactly what's going on and what's happening. So the other piece of the puzzle, the open adoption, I touched on that just a little bit, but you know, open adoptions are legally enforceable in certain states. The problem with that is that a mom who is relinquishing a child, in our experience at SOS, 99% of the time is doing so because of financial hardship. So in order to enforce an open adoption, that's going to involve court. It's going to involve hiring an attorney, and all of that involves money. So the deck again is stacked. She is not going to be able to find an attorney that's going to take her case. And what she really needs is an adoption attorney. You can't just hire a family law attorney or another attorney. You have to have an adoption attorney who understands what those open adoption laws are, like any other line of business in any other business, right? They all specialize in their own line of business. And having an adoption attorney take a natural family's case to enforce an open adoption is a threat to their business. It's professional suicide. And it is going to potentially, if that word gets out that they take adoptive parents to court, their revenue stream is in jeopardy, and they're not going to do that. This is their bread and butter. It's how they eat. So that's not realistic. Sure, you can say they're enforceable and all of that, but really what happens? What has to happen for that to be enforced? Then let's take the next step. Say she does hire an attorney and does find an attorney and find the money to take them to court. The relationship is really strained now. She's filed a motion in court to force them to do something they don't want to do. That's a problem. And who's going to pay for that? The child is going to pay for that. And that's where all of this is supposed to be centered around. And that's not what happens in adoption. After the relinquishment, after the possession is gone from the mother, after the adoption is final, the deck, she has no power. She has no power. So she's at the mercy of the adoption agency and the adoptive parents, period. So I've been in connection with a mom who is, she lives in California, and she actually attempted to keep her son's adoption open. She went to court 67 times and won 67 times to see her son. She never got to see him because a judge cannot force anyone to make a visitation happen. It doesn't happen. So the adoptive parents would move. She would have to find them again, take them back to court. She would win. They would move again. This went on for 13 years, and she won. And eventually what happened was her son got to an age where the judge said, I'm going to have you leave the courtroom, and I'm going to call your son right now, and then I'll call you back in when I'm done. She did that, got a hold of her son, and her son said, I'm tired. I just want to be a kid. And that was it. Sorry.
Next, we have Stanley, who is an intercountry adoptee, late discovery, and the host of the podcast, The Adoption Files.
Hi, thank you for having me here today. It's been wonderful. And, you know, everyone has touched on so many important aspects of this piece of propaganda that they are calling a documentary. And I'd like to just talk a little bit about some of the loaded, really emotive kind of language that they use in this film. We talk about adoption tropes, and the adoption industry has gone to great lengths to take language and imbue it with this symbolism so that they can get people to support their business. So when you watch this, you hear things like meant to be, destiny, families first, like magic, do this for the babies, dreams of a family realized. you know, it builds the life force of the community when they facilitate these adoptions. And they're very proud of the fact that they were among the first to define family in a different way. And they will say that adoption is how families are made. And the choice of the language is very deliberate. This whole film is full of language and symbols and music that supports the idea that this is this wonderful and amazing thing that they are doing in their community. And it's just really disturbing because it's extremely manipulative and it's very dishonest. And as mentioned earlier, in a documentary, you expect a fact-based film, and there's very little full story in this document. It's a fundraising mechanism. And one of the things that I noticed is that the Cradle likes to advertise itself as being a non-sectarian organization. It is not religion based, and so they feel they can facilitate adoptions in a progressive way. First of all, facilitating adoption is not progressive. Facilitating family preservation is progressive. That would be something that they could be doing in the community that would truly be making a difference for the children that they purport to be holding as, you know, their very first priority. Nowhere in this film do I see any mention of advocacy on the part of the Cradle for unrestricted access for adoptees to our original documents. Even with the one adopted person that is, you know, highlighted in the film, there's an acknowledgement that she was not given access to her identity and had to go through a lifetime of trauma and a lifetime, and now she'll live with the knowledge that she never had the opportunity to connect with her mother because her mother's identity was concealed from her by people who say that they had her best interests at heart. One of the things that I really noticed in the film is the use of music to create an atmosphere. And from the very beginning, the music that they choose, and the music is chosen in documentaries and films very carefully, the music that they uses language that references deity. When they talk about the Lord, they use music that uses the word sacred. So if you watch this and you feel like you should donate to this worthy cause, please keep in mind that they are deliberately manipulating your emotions and they are completely leaving out the voices of adoptees and parents. As was said earlier, they speak for us, and that's not okay anymore. They use symbolism and the use of the red couch as a symbol of these happy families. Try to picture that red couch, see that child and those adoptive parents. Now, imagine that couch surrounded by the people whose lives that child will never be able to be a part of. Imagine the mother and the father standing behind that couch. Picture them there, because that's the only way you're going to see them is in your imagination. And that's where we as adoptees too often have to see our families, is in our imagination. Thank you. In closing, we'd like to hear a few words from Cradle adoptee Lynn Grubb.
Thank you, Andi. I just wanted to wrap up with some information related to adoptees' original birth certificates. In the majority of the states in the US, our birth certificates are still being sealed with our original names on them. And many of us have turned to DNA to solve that problem, but it is still an inherent right We believe that we should be entitled to these records. And that is one of my biggest beefs that I have with the Cradle, is that I feel like they're holding my records for ransom. And I do believe, I know that there's a law that they can't provide identifying information, but they know that I know who both of my birth parents are. And I would really like to have my records from them.
Thank you, Lynn. And I want to thank everybody for joining us and our wonderful panel here, Becky and Andy and Lynn and Jamie. Thanks for your input on the Cradle's film, Stories from the Red Couch.